Okay, it's about 2 minutes after 1 o'clock. Welcome, everybody. I think we'll have some more attendees streaming in this new wonderful world of virtual panels. My name is Mark Walsh. I'll be your moderator today for this panel concerning the PPP and CARES and small business and rescue and recovery features and facets that our federal government and the Fed and many other participants are now fully engaged in. I have a little bit of housekeeping to go through for everybody involved, just so we don't have some misunderstandings. First and foremost, I want to make sure everybody understands that the the attendees, you do not have chat function with each other or for me. If you have a question that you'd love to ask a specific panelist or the panel in general, feel free to do that. Hello. Feel free, I'm getting some feedback for it, sorry about that. Feel free to do that in the Q&A button, which should be at the bottom of your screen. That's point number one. Second is that we would love for you that are involved, that are attending, to make sure your full name is on your Zoom screen. If you don't know how to do that, just click on the blue box at the top of your ID on the screen, and it does give you an option to rename or change your name. We'd love to have your full name so we know who was here. In our last session, we had some anonymous questioners, which I think is kind of a challenge. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and make a rule right now. I will not take a question from an anonymous questioner. So if you have Q&A entries, please make sure your name is fully there. Bouncing around, I will probably not be spending a lot of time introducing our three panelists today. There are two features of the internet that I would point your attention to. One is called Google, and the other is called LinkedIn. And for those two sites that you're more than welcome to visit, you and billions of other people, you can learn a lot more about our panelists than the rather skeletal introduction that I will be giving each of them. And lastly, let me just suggest that this is sponsored by the Bipartisan Policy Center. I am a proud board member, former chair of the board of the BPC. Although biased, I would suggest it's one of, if not the most important think tanks in Washington, D.C. The BPC was founded about 12 or 13 years ago by 4 senators, each of whom was head of the Senate in their time: Tom Daschle, George Mitchell, Howard Baker, and Robert Dole. And since its founding, it's been, I think, a real lightning rod and a place for great thought and thought products that have shaped and added to much regulation, legislation, and policy, hence the name. We're proud to list as one of our graduates a senior fellow named Jay Powell. He happens to be kind of important these days, actually quite important to some of the topics that we will speak about today. So with that, the housekeeping is over. We can get right to our panel. I am pleased to be joined. I feel a little bit like the middle square of Hollywood Squares, or the old show, The Brady Bunch, where I was keep pointing to various squares. So I'm not sure which square your screen is pointing to, but I will introduce our panelists. It's Steve Preston. Steve is currently the CEO of Goodwill, but also headed the SBA under the George W. Bush administration in housing and urban development. Chris Hohen-Sarek. Chris is a venture capital and private equity executive and founder of 2 firms, and also from the education arena was former trustee for many years of Johns Hopkins University, his alma mater. And last and certainly not least, Holly Wade, who is the head of research for the National Federation of Independent Businesses. Holly, of course, brings her perspective of a trade association or industry association representing many of the voices of those firmly involved in the middle of this amazing experience we're having of rescue or support or outreach financially and other ways from our federal government to small businesses. They're the experts. If you don't learn something today, I don't take any responsibility, as somebody famously once said. But with that, sorry, I had to sneak that in there. With that, let's begin with round one. I'll have a couple of rounds of questions for our panelists. I may delve in and dive down into one of their responses, may have some back and forth. And then, as I mentioned, for the last 10 or 15 minutes of our hour together, we'll be with Q&A from you. So with that, Steve, I know that the SBA was a cabinet level position, I believe under President Clinton and under President Obama. I'm frankly not sure if it was under President George W. Bush, but its status as a cabinet level position, or certainly these days as an extraordinarily highlighted agency of the federal government, your experience, what was your sense as leadership of your interaction with Treasury, with Commerce, and your ability to represent the voice of small businesses to the federal government?
Yeah, well, one of the things that was very important for me when I was at SBA is I came in about 10 months after Katrina. So and very few of the loans to small businesses or homeowners. Most people don't realize SBA makes home loans and disasters as well. Very few of those went out. So I was sort of in the middle of that escalation process, and uh, can imagine what these people are going through. The coordination, I would say, was good. But I think the coordination really kicks in based on what the issues are. So, for example, when I was at HUD, I was a housing secretary during the housing crisis, 2008, early 2009. Then the coordination with Treasury from HUD, for example, was very significant because we had so many different interactions. And I think what you see right now is the interaction with Treasury is very significant because this is supporting an economic crisis, and these programs need to coordinate with other programs across the federal government. So the coordination, I think, is very specific to the nature of the crisis and the need to coordinate in ways that are relevant to that crisis.
So let me see. You were SBA right after Katrina, and you were housing secretary in the housing crisis. Some might call you Jonah, but your timing your timing has been exquisite in your government agencies. Holly, let's go to you. I mean, you obviously we're kind of starting at the meta level and trying to drill down, and I don't mean to suggest we're coming from the bottom up again, but clearly your organization represents the voice of many who have either applied for or in some ways received some of the help that we're talking about in PPP, CARES, et cetera. And recently, this is the kind of panel where literally things are happening as we speak, literally, that there's been some announcement of the program running out of money. But before we get to that, tell us some of the themes that you're hearing from your membership about this program and its execution.
Sure. So we knew from the mid-March, end of March, started getting calls and emails from our members asking about what this means for them, how do they receive financial assistance, and we knew that some of these loan programs were starting to be developed. And a couple weeks ago, well, about 3 weeks ago, we surveyed a random sample of our members, and about a quarter of them said that they were negatively impacted by the outbreak of coronavirus. And every week since then, we've continued surveying our members, and now it's almost everybody is negatively impacted. The last survey we asked if they had actively tried to apply for the PPP loan, and about 70% said that they had, and about 70% of those said that they have submitted an application. Whether that was approved or denied, that was still in question. And then regarding the EIDL loan facilitated through SBA, about half had applied for that loan. And so as states were able to participate in that loan program, it was a little slow to begin with as far as having small business owners being able to access that program. As that became more nationwide, more found that valuable financial support for them in working capital expenses and things like that. And so about half had applied for those. So many were applying for both loan programs, and the loan programs are different enough where there is a benefit for both of them to many small business owners. And especially as this outbreak continues to negatively impact them, however long the duration of this ends up being, the more important those loan programs will be for small business owners.
Incredible acceleration of your membership, asking for, filing paperwork, et cetera. I think pretty much every small business would mimic the math that you just expressed with your membership. Chris, let me move to you, and I apologize in advance. You're going to be asked to wear many hats in some ways in this conversation, because you're sort of the representative of a few sectors that I think are impacted as much as any. And let's start with technology. You, in your career as a venture and private equity investor and company starter in technology, technology is sort of a bedrock word to imply how the funds of the flow of funds in fintech and these other labels that are being used seems to be thought of by some people as a panacea for all the things that may be going wrong in this program. What's the sense of companies that your firms have invested in, or what you see in the technology arena as ways that technology may be either a help or a hindrance in programs like this and the acceleration of deployment of capital?
Yeah, I think it's a, to your point, I mean, technology certainly one of the advantages now is that it can in fact be used for implementation of things that don't require that face-to-face element of things that right now is that first domino that fell were all the businesses that were face-to-face businesses. And now we have the upstream effect hitting the supply chain and everyone else who's derivative off of those face-to-face experiences that we have. And certainly the advantages of having these technology platforms is our ability to move quickly and in response to everything from filings and other things. At the end of the day, the technology is a tool and obviously a requisite tool. And I can't even imagine if this had occurred 15 or 20 years ago, what the world would be. Because we're all on Zoom right now, and so many things could be moved, if not perfectly, certainly in call it a pass-fail mode. We've been able to move a lot of our activities in this world to virtual activities as we are today on things. And so I think technology has played a really central role, frankly, in keeping it from getting worse. I think the real problem, though, is that it also gives us a tool, but the tool has to be made the decisions have to be made by policymakers. So you can apply for a loan, but if the loan program runs out, or if the loan program is poorly designed, garbage in, garbage out at the end of the day.
Yeah. Well, actually, let me take that point and return to Holly, and I'll ask Steve for you to weigh in as well. I guess it was 3 or 4 hours ago, I think, I saw the headline that as was hinted, the program seems to be out of money, that we've effectively, or the government has effectively deployed a third of $1 trillion in record time. And I'm wondering, what's your sense? I'll start with you, Holly. Who's getting this money? I have seen very few news stories about a given deli or a given dry cleaner or someone like that getting these types of financial commitments. What types of companies is getting this money, and have we actually run out of the funds?
So yes, it does appear that the loan programs, both the EIDL, the EIDL, and the PPPL loan programs are out of money. So NFIB is strongly encouraging Congress to quickly refinance those or recapitalize those programs so that more small business owners can apply and access those needed financial supports. But, as far as the number of small business owners accessing these loans, it was, especially for the PPP loan, fairly complicated for small business owners to understand the loan terms and conditions, and also apply and find a financial institution that would take their loan. So about 27% of our members who we surveyed said that they were essentially shut out of the program because their financial institution wasn't participating in the EI or the PPP loan program. And so that was immensely frustrating. Those who have accountants that they use to do business expenses and things like that and payroll, those who have an accountant on staff or a payroll expert on staff, they generally would likely have a stronger relationship with their banker and be able to facilitate on their end the paperwork part of these loans. But for many small business owners, they do payroll themselves. They are their own accountant. And getting through this process was extremely difficult for many. And we're still hearing from small business owners who are in the process not realizing that the money's gone.
Yeah. Well, I think we've lost Steve. We'll get back with him in just a minute, but let me hop to you, Chris, for a second. Of the portfolio of companies that your firms have invested in, what's your sense of how many of them have successfully waded through the paperwork and process to apply for one of these financial moments?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's it's probably less well understood, but the SBA, which was the appropriate vehicle, plus banks as administrators or data collectors for the system, was the only way this could get itself going. And it is actually an honor system because effectively you have to attest to your being compliant with the rules. And I think the government did actually a remarkable job in a certain respect in standing this up. too late to the degree that these were programs that would have been more useful a month ago before so many people were let go, but nonetheless useful and stood up really, really fast. To some degree, though, there are lots of soft or hard edges, however you want to think about it, of what these loans either cover or don't cover, who they cover or don't cover, because they were shoehorned into existing institutions and existing regulatory or legal frameworks. So an example is there's a rule which is called the affiliate rule, which essentially speaks to the fact that loans are only made available to certain organizations. And this affiliate rule was basically a way that said, if there was some form of common ownership or common investors, therefore, if you aggregate all of the organizations, one looks below it and there are more than 500 employees, you're just not eligible for it. And so as a consequence, right now, if you look overall, this affiliate rule had its origins for different purposes. And it was designed to essentially make sure that the SBA loans were made available, and therefore, if there were other forms of capital available to small companies, that you wouldn't use the SBA. Understand its history and its relevance. But the consequence, to answer your question, the consequence is that for most companies that have had as investors venture or private equity investors, they've been ineligible for the SBA programs. And so in our case, for instance, there are some things and it's ambiguous because the guidance is not clear in certain cases, but I'll give you one very specific one, and I won't name the company, but we have an organization that actually is a school in a large city, and it employs roughly about 400 or so employees. And we had read from one group of law firms saying that it was eligible and actually applied, and we're told the money is available and it's going to be funded in 2 weeks, and it will literally be irrelevant to that organization in making sure that employment is kept intact and that the organization has a future. And then we got a word last night that said it's not completely clear. A different group of law firms said, well, may not. Now all of a sudden we're facing the prospect that says, well, we might be forced into different action. So the point is that the system right now isn't perfect for any participants. And in our case, on around roughly 28 companies that we're involved in, there might be 2 or 3 that have been able to, even though the other ones, frankly, we faced in a number of cases precipitous drop off in consumer demand on healthcare companies and other places, that because of the virus, the sort of earthquake effect has destroyed a number of those businesses for the moment. And the question will be, can they survive ultimately to when this is a little bit more in the rearview mirror?
I'll return to the affiliated, the affiliate rule, because I think that's actually, I'd love to drill down a little bit, because although you've explained it clearly, I'm not sure everybody gets their head around it as clearly as they should. Number one. Number two, I'm shocked and saddened that 2 different law firms would have different opinions on your outcome, Chris. I thought lawyers thought the same. And just as a sidebar before I get to Holly with the follow-up on this, the IRS each year has a bunch of their people call in pretending to be citizens with questions about the IRS forms. And again, shockingly, they can often get very different advice from various IRS employees that are on the helpline. So complexity breeds, I guess, legal fees and accounting fees, but sometimes does not breed clarity. But Holly, let me take that issue to you. I have been told by some folks in the legal community and ex-Department of Justice people that there's a number of companies that filed the applications for the money rapidly because they were concerned about it going away, which seems to be a fair concern now. So they wanted to get in front of the queue as fast as they possibly could. And they didn't know all of the paperwork that the SBA would have typically generated for a 7A loan or those loans. So they filled out the initial form. They made assertions about their company size, type of business, seasonal workers, whatever, filed it, and then they get more data and more documents from a traditional SBA pathway, and they realize they've said something that is actually not correct. Do you see a collision between these assertions made by kind of quickly handed out, welcome back, Steve, quickly handed out documents, and then the challenge of some of those assertions being wrong later? Do you think this will be a legal imbroglio?
This will be a huge, huge problem for small business owners. The immediacy to apply for this loan was broadcasted widely through many channels, so that, I mean, they knew that they had to file and apply as quickly as possible. And now we're hearing from many small business owners who are saying, either I didn't calculate the employees correctly, I included independent contractors and I wasn't supposed to, all sorts of things. But also, when they start receiving these loans, it is going to be difficult because many will likely use the loan for purposes that weren't intended to use. But we don't have guidance on what the penalties are or things like that. But there will be absolutely challenges on the back end as far as how they applied for the loan and being in violation of the terms and conditions, and then also spending the loan. And that's not surprising, since, a lot of these restrictions and parameters related to the loan are quite complicated. And there isn't, just very specific guidance for every situation of employees. So, we're certainly trying to get out as much information as possible to our members, but we definitely see on the back end that this is going to be hugely confusing and complicated, especially when they don't have many resources to go back and ask, somebody in their bank to clarify anything or help them modify their application. There just aren't enough resources for all of that.
Chris, I'll get to you in a sec. Steve, we assume you dropped off to apply for a PPP loan, which I hope the paperwork was put through. And
well, after I heard that they were out of money, I went to check on our application. Sorry,
Chris, you had your hand up.
Oh, I just was going to say, it's hard right now because every day right now in Corona world, every day is a month. So it matters greatly. Every day has deep consequences that we saw today, and the unemployment numbers again, and weeks are really very consequential. So I think it's hard to, what we have to ask at the end is, with so many people needing so much assistance, how can the government act quickly and efficiently to answer some of these things? And so as an example, and Holly sort of made a reference to this, which is it would be useful to understand, for instance, I don't think we'll have an ability to go and ask the question on every detail and have the government opine on a specific set of circumstances. Impossible at volume. But for instance, if the government said the consequence for making an error here might be you might be forced to repay the loan back quicker, or something that was clear and definitive, but as we always say to organizations that we're involved in, the first thing you do is you don't do anything that puts you in jail. That's number one. And then you keep going down basically the list of things that you do and don't do. But right now it's ambiguous enough that you don't know if you're going to cross something and what happens if you cross that line by accident. And I think issuing some very clear and unambiguous guidance that lets people have the flexibility to make a couple of small errors, frankly, at this moment in time, and understand the consequences so that they're not so dire, because people are making almost literally life and death decisions, but certainly decisions on employees right now that are pushing people. And I know, and I'll stop here, but I know organizations who are making decisions because they say, we can furlough people because they're going to get benefits. And therefore, the choice is we may be out of business, but if we were to furlough people, we may have a chance to stay in business. And those employees will be covered by government benefits. And we'll be able to rehire them if our business gets better. That is not a virtuous circle. We should be in the business of retaining employees, not relying on essentially a government program to take care of them. And yet, if one creates a circumstance with very negative consequences for footfalls, more people will choose that path, which isn't a great path. We should work to keep our businesses together, not put them in jeopardy.
So this is the private equity version of the Hippocratic Oath, which goes do no harm. Your version is do not serve time, right? That's your, that's your original.
I try to start every morning with that. It's a little prayer, I say.
So Steve, I'm going to hammer you with two questions, since it's never step away from the table, because you'll be given many assignments, as the old law says in business. But before I get to the not-for-profit arena, which you and I chatted about the other day, about how this is a whole nother facet of these economic events going on, let me start with the SBA. As leader, you saw, and I think when we chatted the other day, you mentioned, you ticked off 4 or 5 names of people that were on your team that are now in leadership position, including the fellow that ran disaster, et cetera, et cetera. So you know the team, you know
Yeah.
the structure, you know the building, you know how the processes worked. What was your reaction when you heard the dollar figures and the agency and the compression of volume through that pipeline that you knew so well?
Yeah, well, I looked for a paper bag to breathe into. So when you think about the EIDL loans, those are all processed and dispersed through the SBA. And in Katrina, we probably had, call it $200,000, $250,000, 250,000 loans, which was a historically high volume. They've already gotten hit with 3 million. Okay. And so you don't have sort of people sitting in the wings just ready to process these loans, right? Now, one of the things we did back then is we designed an escalation plan for future events and submitted it to Congress. So I've actually been through the process of laying out what that would look like. But you don't have loan officers, you don't have people, you need people physically to go through these documents and be able to get them approved. And obviously, online applications help, any number of other automated processes help, but the volume here is multiples of what we've seen in the largest disaster in history. And so it's a massive human burden, operational burden that has to be handled. Now, so I think that's important. That's very important to understand. I also want to mention, they ran out of money very quickly, which is a separate issue, but which is a challenge. The other thing I want to mention in all of this is I think one of the frustrating things for all of us is there's not guidance, and then you get guidance, and then the guidance changes, and then something else happens. But this stuff is happening so quickly. When the government needs to iterate a couple of times to get it better, it's usually a value to all of us because the first iteration might not be right. And it's not like you have a bunch of Apple engineers kind of sitting back saying, what should the next iteration look like? Let's plan for that. This is something that just happened, and it exploded unbelievably quickly. And it's a new kind of disaster, and it's matched with all sorts of different kinds of economic aid. So cycling through this stuff and getting it right, and then actually turning it into an implementation plan is just an overwhelming burden for these agencies.
So the burden is there. It looks like they're trying like hell to manage the burden. We touched earlier on, they are asserting they're out of money. I'll circle back to you, Steve, on the not-for-profit arena, but Holly, let me ask you, and Chris, you can weigh in as well. It looks like at the national level, there's another 150 or 250 billion being thought of as an additional slug of money into this, and we haven't even discussed some of the ways the Fed has rolled out, in some ways, corporate bailouts or corporate support. Holly, what are you hearing from your members or from your government relations or legislative staff on whether there's another slug coming down the pipe?
We're certainly hopeful. We're in constant contact with folks in Congress about making sure that they can get more money approved quickly. So hopefully this weekend to Monday, we'll see something develop on that end. Small business owners are sitting there waiting for financial assistance to get through this. And it'll need to be much more than was appropriated initially for, frankly, both those loans, because both those loans have very distinct benefits to them for small business owners and how they can deal with the crisis.
Chris, as a private equity and venture investor, I'll bet you agree that sometimes it's almost worse to give a company too much money too quickly than it is to have the company grow and mature and be an adults about how they handle incoming funds and how they deploy their cost structure. This is a dump truck of cash being thrown out. I mean, forgive the term. I think it really is a compressed amount of capital being sent out to many, many people. What are some of the things you're seeing in the industry, if not your own portfolio, where companies are getting capital that may or may not need it in the fashion it's being deployed?
Yeah, I actually don't think the quantum of money, based upon what we're seeing out there, actually, it seems like an enormous amount of money, but quite frankly, on a relative basis, the level of economic destruction that's taken place is so vast and so large. And you see the evidence. And one of the problems is we as a society tend to look at things retrospectively and use data to make decisions. You can't do that here. The time does not. Look, our official unemployment rate in the country, I think, still is around 4%. And that simply ignores the fact that our real unemployment is probably mid-teens by now. And so the point is that you have to make judgments about what's really genuinely happening on the street right now. Holly sees it, Steve sees it, we see it. The amount of money that we're talking about is not being used and is quite frankly is inadequate to, at this point, to deal with it, partly because the destruction has already taken place. And so a lot of these businesses are really in genuine trouble. There's a condition in the loan programs in some respects. Some of them are just not intentionally designed poorly, but end up, for instance, having to spend the money not only just categorically certain ways, but also within a time allowance. The ability to say, I have to get all this money spent in a certain amount of time, that could distort behaviors. For instance, you may make the wrong moves because if you don't spend it, you'll lose it. And that's a place where right now we see things that could be errors. And it's not that the money is adequate, but it may be that I think it was designed assuming that the crisis was going to be over within 90 days, which seems very unlikely at this point. This is a long-term structural problem, and in our opinion, is going to last a much longer period of time. So I think it's less about quantum, more about details. I think the quantum is ultimately is not enough, and I would ask Congress to essentially be in session immediately, because right this second, any thought that we can wait around until for 2 or 3 weeks, let's not forget that on March 1st. I think there were 30 cases of corona that were officially diagnosed in this country. Time is not our friend at this moment. And so we have to take it very, very seriously with every day mattering.
Yes, Holly.
Yeah, when we surveyed our members a couple of weeks ago and asked them how long they could last and survive and operate their businesses the way they were doing, given the current economic conditions, about half said less than 2 months. And things have deteriorated since then. So as Chris said, time is of the essence. They are hanging on, as much as they can to retain employees. But every day that goes by, they're having to make more and more difficult decisions about what to do going forward.
Well, as somebody said, speed and legislation tend not to go well together. And I think this is one of those potential examples, one we may be talking about for a long time. And let me remind our attendees that we're about 8 to 10 minutes away from Q&A. So feel free or at your leisure to go to the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and post those questions, which I will review and curate along with my teammates here, and then ask our panel. But let's move to you, Steve. I mentioned earlier about your engagement in the not-for-profit arena, as it is now able to apply for these types of capital commitments. Walk us through what your experience is being and what you see other not-for-profits either seeing or not receiving and receiving. What's the market there?
Yeah, well, so there are a couple of things. I think, first of all, I think it's important to understand that the impact on nonprofits is twofold. Number one, we're massive employers, 12 million people in the economy. I think we're the third largest sector after retail and hospitality. So the impact on employees is massive. And when we can't operate, we then can't perform community services that are spiking dramatically right now. So the impact on the country is twofold there. What we're finding is nonprofits are sort of being tucked in to the different pieces of legislation. So we can apply for PPP up to 500 employees. So any nonprofit that's larger than 500 employees can't go for the PPP. And as a result, you have some larger nonprofits with very important networks who've got a very significant presence in communities who can't get access to it. They can go for the SBA EIDL program, but that maxes out at $2 million. And a couple of weeks ago, they basically knocked everybody down to $25,000 because they ran out of money. So they're sort of, they're sort of tucked into curious places. And theoretically, under the Economic Stabilization Fund, which theoretically is still forthcoming, larger nonprofits can apply, but that program hasn't been designed. There's not guidance. There's no mechanism in place. So It's sort of been a little bit patchwork, and it's been fully inadequate for, I shouldn't say fully inadequate, because where we are accessing those funds are very helpful, but it's really not adequate. And from our perspective, PPP, the size limit on PPP for nonprofits should come off. You just need to be able to make sure that we, at a time when demands are greater than ever, need to be able to perform our services in communities that need us. And you see that in immediate needs, like with Feeding America and housing operations. But for us, we perform job services, for God's sake, and we've gone from fewer than 6 million unemployed at the end of the year to adding 22 million people to the to the unemployment rolls in the last month. So there's going to quickly be a reckoning when we see people not being able to go to the places that they used to for help if nonprofits don't survive.
Well, speaking of nonprofits that have a large impact in our society, Chris, I'll point to you here. You spent a number of years as a trustee of a major private research university in the East Coast, Johns Hopkins, and spent a lot of your time in the education arena at the technology side of it and the content side of it. Obviously, colleges, universities are under significant duress financially now, with a lack of student attendance and potentially not starting next academic year in September if this continues. What's your sense of that sector specifically, in ways that they may get or apply for help from the federal government, or perhaps even their state?
There's been some money set aside for the higher ed community, but on a relative basis, it's very small, and on the relative budget basis on things. I think there are issues. I think that in K-12, which between K-12 and higher ed, it's the second largest part of the economy behind healthcare. So these are very large numbers, both at the employer level and economic impact in the country. At K-12, briefly, you've got 50 or so million students that are now at home, but also you've got 50 million working families that have now no longer have the custodial function of a K-12 environment that lets them go to work. And so I think as a society, we have little choice but to tackle the problem outside of, we can all imagine scenarios in the fall where it is impossible to do some of these things by virtue of what viral infections look like. Let's put aside those for a moment, because that caveat exists for everything we do at this point. But under where we have to look at a restart in the economy, we do have to look at this and tackle the problem more directly and say, what are the conditions that have to exist so that we can function in more of a face-to-face world in K-12 as well as in higher ed? I think that, to your point on higher ed, and I think that there is a very dangerous thing that's actually occurring right now, which is a lemming effect, whereas one school after another sort of contemplates the idea of maybe delaying starts. It sounds benign, but in higher education, there are some that are well capitalized. The Harvards of the world, the Yales of the world with huge endowments. They're a tiny part of a very, very broad system that serves 20 million people. And the truth is that most students, the idea, by the way, that the conditions that allow you to function will change between September and January, which is the difference between a fall start and a spring start. I see nothing on that would evidence that there will be a change, like a vaccine in widespread use or other things. So as a consequence, a punt, like let's start late in January, is actually a punt for the year.
Yeah.
And that will actually put out of business hundreds, if not ultimately thousands of institutions, because they don't know what they've backed themselves into. And so I think that the consequence of not tackling the problem directly and saying, we must design a way to operate face-to-face with constraints so that we can continue to function. This is the second largest part of the economy. You can't let it sort of by accident cascade backwards and then have it not function. It has too many other consequences.
Well, Holly, I'm sure as in your research, you're finding that, to Chris's point, a significant number of independent small businesses, in fact, do rely on the custodial element of sending their kids off to school and then going and taking care of their business. Has this issue popped up in the conversations with your members?
Oh, absolutely. We hear from our members all the time about different situations that they have, either, if they have children themselves, but also their employees who aren't able to come into work, and then the employer is subject to the emergency FMLA that was in the second phase of coronavirus-related relief. And they have to pay, 10 weeks, but they get 100% to recoup the cost. But the kid care provisions in the paid sick leave and the emergency medical family leave, do kind of deal with some of these issues that employees are having. But again, it's getting very complicated for employers to know what they're supposed to do, how they're supposed to do it, under what circumstances. And so, and we don't see this problem or these issues going away anytime soon. As everybody has alluded to, this is going to be a long-standing problem for some time now.
Well, much like a YouTube video that is interrupted by a commercial, I must say that paid family leave and a wide variety of the issues we've discussed in the last 40 minutes are elements of thought silos and thought product of the Bipartisan Policy Center, the sponsoring organization of today's chat. So forgive the intrusion. You can click on this skip ad button now in the bottom of your screen. But I do want to endorse what was just said, and Holly's point about paid family leave. Again, one of many issues that the BPC is drilling down on in a significant way. Well, we're close to the Q&A part, so I could talk with you guys all day, although I doubt you would like that. But I will end with a question before we get to Q&A, and it's an unfair one. But I'll start with you, Chris, and then we'll cycle around. One of the things about compressed time programs is that usually the assessment tools for them, what does success mean, also get compressed and sometimes perverted or twisted and really inapplicable. What's your sense of who and how and where and when we will decide and then assess whether PPP and IEDL or all of this jumble, this alphabet jumble, is a success?
Yeah, it's a really tough thing. I think the problem is we're living it every day. So it's a little like in the middle of the hurricane, deciding whether or not you're stepping left or right, and whether or not a branch hits you in the face. I think in the end, this will be up to ultimately voters and academics to determine whether or not we're doing the right things, both the people around this table and our elected officials and members of the Fed and others. We're going to get sort of a read, if you will, a temperature check this fall on what people think. And, not to speak politically, but what I would say is, I would think that at the end of the day, we're going to be voting as citizens on who's going to be able to take us from here to there, from whatever the state is of the economy to a state that restores some level of greater prosperity, because I don't think we will be there by the fall. So I think perhaps the votes will actually count a lot toward both an assessment of what we've done and where we're going and who can take us there on that side of things. And I'll say one specific item, which is it's very easy to get pulled into viewing things as, are we supporting those that are hurt? And I think there should be another measurement, which is, are we taking the actions to prevent the hurt from happening? So instead of worrying to some degree about whether or not we're providing adequate unemployment benefits, I honestly wish we were more in the business of measuring things by virtue of keeping unemployment from happening to start with. And that would be a better measurement tool in my mind.
So Holly, if we get the extra slug of money, it'll be what, $500 billion will be applied to these challenges. What's your definition of success, or how do you think it will be defined?
So the analogy that we've been using lately is, it's kind of like maintenance of a plane while it's in air. And it's just a big challenge to figure out what that looks like on the other side as far as success. But as much as small business owners can keep connected with their employees so that when they can get to the other side and start growing their business again, when customers start going back to normal economic behavior, all of those functions are, more or less intact. We hear from members all the time wanting to make sure that they can keep connected with their employees who they have trained and skilled up, and they rely on them, and they're going to have to rely on them going further if they get back into, if they get kind of lost in the government system of unemployment insurance. It's just going to take that much longer to reconnect and get things going again. So I think that would be a definition of success, how much we can continue to keep intact employers and employee relations as much as possible.
Steve, before I go to you, I would just suggest that our attendees Google Arne Sorensen, the CEO of Marriott. He recently posted a video presentation for his employees and colleagues, and really to the market in general, to your point, Holly, about relationships, basically talking about how Marriott was, as you might imagine, decimated by the last month and a half, and how the brand and what the brand means to travelers, what the brand means to vendors, to the Marriott brand, all up and down the supply chain and the consumer relationship chain, was an amazing set of thoughts and comments. I think it's one of the most touching and substantive corporate communications things I've ever seen. So I highly encourage you to Google Arne Sorensen, CEO of Marriott, and his recent set of comments. So Steve, I'll end with you on this final note before we go to Q&A. What do you think success will mean, and who will judge it?
So I think I would agree with both of the other panelists, and I guess so. Let me just give one additional take on this, because we're talking about specific funding programs right now between PPP and EIDL and the economic stabilization and some other programs. I think at the end of the day, these programs are designed for a group of organizations. And you will see at the end of the day, we're going to see enormous fallout in the next 3 to 6 months. And I think in 6 months down the road, as we look back at this, we will see organizations that weren't saved and organizations that were saved, and we're going to be able to parse out what worked in these programs, what didn't, who fell through the cracks, why the structures allowed people to fall through the cracks. And I do think you're going to have a lot of people looking back on this to say, you know what, if it had been designed a little bit differently, or if we'd included this group, or we had done this, it would have had a fundamentally different impact. And there's just going to be a lot of fallout. And it will happen, I think, in many cases, because of, let's call design flaws. Now, I'm concerned about that, because I think people are doing the best job they can with the information they have to move quickly, to get past politics and make this stuff happen. But it's not perfect. There are issues, and we're going to see the fallout from that.
There's an old saw in the software industry. You can get it fast, good, or cheap.
Yeah.
Pick two, right? You can't have all three. Yeah. And I think we're in that kind of milieu now. I noticed, just as a sidebar, and I hope I have this right, Ruth Chris Steakhouse got a $20 million infusion from the federal government. I'm not sure.
Wow.
In the heat of the moment, it's hard to sort of view that. I mean, no disrespect to Ruth Chris Steakhouse. I've certainly plowed a lot of money into their pocket from my gullet over the years, but it's interesting to see I think we'll see a lot of brands to the point of this conversation that later on we'll maybe scratch our head and said, what the heck was going on there? One of the questions, moving now into Q&A, that I'm going to curate from our audience is a interesting issue that actually has a much higher mathematical impact than I would have thought. And Holly, I'll start with you to give a shot at answering this. I guess there's about 5 million people on parole or on probation in America. And the PPP program, and I think actually all of them, prohibit those with direct interaction with the prison system and the legal system from receiving these types of loans. And I would argue that many, many small businesses actually are started or are run by folks who have come out of the system and are trying to redo their life. What's your sense of any action on allowing that pretty sizable chunk of our population to get access to this capital?
So no, I mean, I think any owner that goes out there and finds, a market opportunity to start a business, I mean, it's a huge endeavor. It's a huge energy expense on the person to create something like that. And, I think that's very unfortunate that there are populations of people who are business owners that have, tried it out and put resources and time and energy into it that can't access these financial support systems, these two loans. And, everybody that is in that camp, should be able to access.
Yeah. Well, I think it's probably going to be a legislative thing. And speaking of legislative, another question, Chris, to you, this affiliate clause, do you know of any significant rapid action that will be able to remove that from the paperwork or alter it so it doesn't penalize the types of structures you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, I think the challenge, and the reason it's a challenge is that, it's while private equity as a term we can debate it as a good or bad for society at a different time. But what I can tell you is there are about 15 million people who work either directly for private equity firms, about half of that, or for private equity-backed companies, or about roughly the same, about half of that are for the direct suppliers for those private equity-backed organizations. So it's about 10% of the workforce. So excluding that group in total by sort of call it an artifact of the history of the SBA isn't necessarily productive, because it does pick winners and losers not on the merits of the company, but on this kind of more obscure rule. So I think it's being discussed, and there's and if one wants the moral hazard issue to be eliminated, one could do things like say, if the private equity firm has to have expended all of the monies that it is legally allowed to expend to a company before tapping government money. There are things that one could add in simple terms that could eliminate moral hazard issues. So I think as long as there's looked at and somebody says, I'm going to fix it, which is what I think somebody should do, one can design solutions. Up to this point, there's so much on the plate of legislators and on administrators that it's not clear to me it's seeing the light of day, but it's a material sized problem just by virtue of the number of employees involved.
Holly, did you raise your hand?
No.
Okay. Got to be careful when it's like being in an auction. You don't want to bid and not know it. Well, let's go to our final question, which I will wrap up our conversation today with, and it's the quintessential crystal ball magic wand moment question. And I'll start with you, Steve, and go around Holly, and then Chris, you'll back clean up here. If you could change, if you were in charge of the whole Megillah for one day, forget the day, the time period, what's the one thing you would either add or remove or enforce or encourage in today's structure that if you were in charge, you would amend? Steve?
Well, it's hard for me not to look from where I sit today. And where I sit today, it's very clear that the immense need to address human needs is not only right upon us, but expanding dramatically. And I think Congress and the administration need to understand what that immense human need is going to look like and work with the providers of those services to do that. And so organizations like ours who, provide workforce services, or other people who help people get their lives back and move back into society in an orderly way are going to need to have the tools in place to do that. So I know that's coming out of my world, but if the service providers in our communities aren't there, the human fallout is going to be significantly more dramatic. And so that's what I would focus on.
Holly, magic wand day, what would you do?
Magic wand, I would loosen the restrictions on the loan program so that small business owners can use the funds in a way that makes sense to keep their business operating. And then on the other side, allow for far more flexibility when mistakes are made, and to have some sort of safe harbor so they don't get caught on the other side, with a mountain of issues and problems related to compliance with these very complicated loans.
Chris, last but not least, what would you do?
All right, I'm going to violate your rules, Mark. I won't keep it to one. See, I get to do that on cleanup here. But I'd say eliminate the affiliate rule. I would actually start a program for the failed businesses, because I think we have a landscape right now that is resulting in large volumes of failed businesses, and our system of dealing with failed businesses through the courts is going to be just, it's going to be horrific. And you will end up, you need a restart fund from the government that allows operators to restart businesses, to create agency between operators and their creditors, whether they're landlords or whether they are actual creditors, and change the dynamic. Because right now we favor, as a country, landlords and creditors. And what we need to do is to start favoring the business operators. And I would redirect monies, instead of bailing out landlords, bail out operators, and let them be the renegotiation and the flow of funds there. And then the third one, and I'll stop there, is
Yes.
that I would, the one sector that's been lost in all of the funding sources right now are growth companies. And those growth companies represent, sort of by proof of what they are, the next large employers in the marketplace. And right now, you either have to be small or you have to be making money. And by virtue of eliminating growth companies from access to capital, they're the ones who have the least access today because they rely on venture and other sources which are shut off. And yet they're the ones that have the greatest growth of employment. And they're right now the ones shut off. So those are my three. So thank you.
Well, I got to offer Holly and Steve another bite at the
All
apple.
right,
Anything come to mind?
Yeah, you know what I would say is, I think we're talking about sort of these, economic supports and other programs. I think very quickly, we need to understand what moving back into normalcy looks like in a safe way. And we really don't have a vision for that. And when people start going to stores again, going to restaurants again, hopping on planes again, and understanding how to do that safely, all of these issues become significantly less important because the economy starts getting going again. But we don't have visibility to that. And I don't think we have a common thread of trust, because a lot of people are saying different things. So I would lean heavily into how do you drive some degree of normalcy and safety so that people can begin moving forward with their lives and spending and kicking the economy and jobs back into gear.
Holly?
I would second what Chris said about those businesses that will ultimately fail in this crisis, and making sure there is some sort of support system for them so that they can either, deal with the debts, the mounting debts that they'll likely have, the legal issues that they'll have to incur, but also allow them to restart and build up another business without any additional hurdles for having not been able to make it through this crisis.
So I knew when all three of you agreed that we would have a hell of a panel with very, very different perspectives, all fully informed, and you delivered today. And I think I speak for all of my colleagues at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and I think all the attendees at issuing a giant thank you to you three panelists for your time today and your opinions. It was educational, it was informative, and it was very, very entertaining for all the right reasons. So a big thank you to you. Thank you to our attendees. We hope you enjoyed it, and have a great rest of the week.